All right, let's dive in. Nostradamus, right. This guy's a legend, and you guys are super curious about him.
Yeah, he's definitely captured people's imaginations for centuries.
So we've got a ton of your sources here, websites, Wikipedia, even a YouTube transcript from like 1979. You really want to get to the bottom of who Nostradamus was, what he actually wrote, and why we're still talking about him 500 years later.
Definitely. It's a question that's fascinated scholars and the public for generations.
Okay, so first things first, did you know that Nostradamus wasn't just some like mystical fortune teller? He was actually a respected doctor.
That's right. His medical background is often overlooked.
And some folks even believe he predicted major events like the Great Fire of London and the rise of Hitler. We're going to get to all that, but first, let's rewind the clock a bit. Let's meet Michel de Nostradam, the man behind the myth.
Sounds good. To understand Nostradamus' legacy, we need to understand his background. He was born in 1503 in France.
Okay, 16th century France. Got it.
And his family had converted from Judaism to Catholicism just a generation earlier.
Wow, so he was growing up kind of between two worlds in a way.
Precisely. And this blend of cultural and religious influences is considered by some scholars to be really crucial to understanding the symbolism and the themes that he wove into his prophecies.
Interesting. So what about his education? I mean, I'm guessing prophecy school wasn't exactly a thing back then.
You're right, there was no formal training for seers. But his early education was surprisingly diverse.
Okay, tell me more.
He was taught medicine by his grandfather, a physician, and then his other grandfather, who was really steeped in classical literature and philosophy, instilled in him a love for the ancient world.
So we've got a blend of science and the humanities, kind of a Renaissance man in the making.
Exactly. And that foundation in both science and symbolism is likely what shaped his really unique approach to understanding the world.
It's like a perfect recipe for someone like Nostradamus.
Right.
But his path wasn't exactly a straight line, right? Our sources mention that the plague disrupted his university studies.
Yes, that's right. He was studying at the University of Avignon when the plague hit, and it forced him to become what they called a wandering scholar.
So instead of hitting the books, he was hitting the road. That must have been an incredible experience.
Imagine a young Nostradamus traveling across Europe, seeking knowledge.
Not just from books, I bet.
Exactly. Through direct experience, encountering all these different cultures and ideas. And this is where he likely began to kind of synthesize his knowledge of medicine, astrology, and those esoteric traditions.
Okay, so we've got this foundation of medicine, ancient wisdom, and then this period of travel and exploration. But let's talk about the plague. That must have had a profound impact on him, right? I mean, both personally and professionally.
Oh, absolutely.
And you mentioned he became a doctor. Was his approach to medicine, like, typical for that time?
Not at all. What's fascinating is that he really emphasized hygiene.
Hygiene, like washing your hands.
Exactly. Centuries before germ theory was a thing, Nostradamus was advocating for hand washing, cleaning wounds, fresh air.
That's pretty revolutionary for that time period.
Right. These were radical ideas back then.
It's like he was intuitively understanding the importance of sanitation.
Yeah, he was ahead of his time in many ways.
And then there's this whole thing with the rose pill that pops up in our sources. It's mentioned as his claim to fame in the medical field. So, what do we know about this mysterious remedy?
Well, the rose pill was supposedly designed to protect against the plague, but its exact composition remains a bit of a mystery.
A mystery. Even better.
Some speculate that it contained rose hips, which are known for their high vitamin C content, and that could have offered some immune support.
Okay, so maybe a little bit of science behind it, potentially.
Possibly. Whether it was truly effective, well, we may never know for sure. But it did earn him widespread recognition, and some argue paved the way for his later transition towards prophecy.
It's interesting that this shift happened when he was around 40 years old. What prompted him to move from healing the body to, like, predicting the future?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Was there, like, a specific event or a personal crisis that triggered this change?
That's a question that's puzzled scholars for centuries.
Yeah.
Our sources don't give a definitive answer. But around this time, he did experience a devastating personal tragedy. He lost his wife and 2 children to the plague.
Oh, wow, that's heartbreaking.
It definitely had a profound impact on him. And it's possible that this loss, along with his experiences during those plague years, led him to search for a deeper meaning, to understand the forces that were shaping human destiny.
So grief, a search for meaning, that makes sense.
It's a theory.
But he didn't just become like a fortune teller gazing into a crystal ball, right? He went deep into some pretty complex stuff.
Oh, absolutely. He immersed himself in astrology, alchemy, and Kabbalah, drawing from a really diverse range of esoteric traditions.
It's like he was trying to decode the universe.
In a way, he was. He particularly embraced judicial astrology, which uses planetary positions and celestial events to make predictions about things happening here on Earth.
Wait, hold on. Judicial astrology, can you explain that a little bit? I'm guessing it's not the same as, like, reading my daily horoscope in the newspaper?
You're right, it's a lot more complex than that. Judicial astrology, as practiced by Nostradamus, involved creating these detailed astrological charts, and then he would interpret the movements and the relationships between planets to try to forecast major events, things like wars, natural disasters, the rise and fall of leaders. It was a really specialized and quite controversial field, even in the 16th century.
Controversial, how so? I thought back then people were pretty into astrology and all that mystical stuff.
Well, astrology was popular, but Nostradamus' methods were considered unorthodox, even by contemporary astrologers.
So he was already, like, shaking things up.
Yeah, he was definitely pushing boundaries. They criticized his interpretations, saying he relied too much on his own intuitive readings of those celestial patterns, instead of sticking to those traditional astrological principles. And that, of course, just added to the mystique around him.
He was a rebel. I love it. So he's bucking trends, raising eyebrows with his unique approach, and then there's his writing style. Like, he chose to write his prophecies in these quatrains.
Yes, these four-line verses.
Four-line verses packed with symbolism and deliberately obscure language. Why make it so cryptic?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah. Was it like a code only he could crack?
Well, it's fueled centuries of debate. Some argue that he did it to protect himself from persecution because prophecy could be dangerous business back then. Others believe he truly thought these prophecies were divinely inspired, and the obscure language was meant to kind of safeguard that knowledge, protect it from falling into the wrong hands.
So self-preservation, divine inspiration, or maybe a little bit of both.
It's hard to say for sure.
I'm guessing that cryptic style also added to his popularity, because who doesn't love a good mystery? But before we crack open those quatrains, let's talk about his almanacs. These were like his early hits, right?
Yes, the almanacs were incredibly popular.
Like bestsellers.
Totally. Imagine them as the 16th century version of, like, a hit magazine.
With all the hot goss.
Kind of. They were filled with a mix of practical information, weather forecasts, agricultural advice, and then alongside that, you'd get these tantalizing predictions about the future.
That's a smart marketing strategy. Give people what they need and what they secretly crave.
And what worked? They were a huge hit with the public. And they even caught the attention of some very powerful figures.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were a huge hit. And speaking of powerful figures, you won't believe who became one of his most devoted readers.
Okay, spill the tea. Who are we talking about?
Catherine de Medici, the Queen of France.
No way. The Queen herself.
Yep, she was completely captivated by his almanacs. So much so that she summoned Nostradamus to her court.
Wow, he was like a 16th century celebrity.
You could say that. She wanted him to explain his prophecies in more detail and even cast horoscopes for her children.
Okay, that must have been both amazing and terrifying at the same time. Imagine having the Queen of France as your biggest fan, but also, like, your potential critic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially considering that Nostradamus wasn't exactly universally loved. He had his share of, critics and detractors.
Haters gonna hate.
Right. Some even went so far as to accuse him of being a heretic or, get this, a servant of the devil.
Whoa, that's intense. I guess dabbling in prophecy can be a bit risky. It's always been a bit of a tightrope walk, hasn't it? Between belief and skepticism.
Definitely. Even today, people are either totally convinced by his predictions or they think it's all just a bunch of hooey.
It's like he tapped into something timeless, that human fascination with the unknown, with what the future holds.
Exactly. And that's part of the reason why he continues to fascinate us even centuries later. He speaks to those really primal human desires, to understand fate, destiny, to have a glimpse of what's coming next.
Okay, so we've talked about his life, his early work. Now let's get to the main event. Les Prophéties. This is the big one, right?
Yeah.
The work that really cemented his legacy.
This is it. Published in 1555, Les Prophéties contains nearly 1,000 of those cryptic quatrains, four-line verses that claim to predict events spanning centuries.
1,000 cryptic predictions. Talk about ambitious. All right, so we know he wrote in quatrains. We know they were intentionally cryptic. But what are some of the recurring themes in Les Prophéties? Like, What kinds of events was he supposedly predicting? Give us the juicy stuff.
Well, it covers a vast range of themes and events. He writes about wars and conquests, natural disasters, plagues and famines, the rise and fall of empires, and even the coming of the Antichrist.
Okay, whoa, that escalated quickly. The Antichrist, that's some serious apocalyptic stuff.
Right, and a lot of these themes really reflect the anxieties and uncertainties of his time. It was a period marked by religious conflict, political upheaval, and the constant threat of disease. I mean, the plague was a very real and terrifying presence.
It's amazing how those anxieties still resonate with us today, even though we live in a totally different world.
I know, right? It's like he tapped into some fundamental human fears and fascinations that transcend time and place.
Fears about the future, about what might be coming next. It's something we can all relate to. Okay, but now we have to talk about the elephant in the room. The claims that Nostradamus predicted specific historical events. We're talking about stuff like the Great Fire of London, the French Revolution, the rise of Hitler, even 9/11. So how do we approach those claims with a critical eye? Like, where do we even begin?
Well, it's important to remember that the language of the quatrains is incredibly dense, incredibly symbolic, really open to multiple interpretations. And that's led to endless debate about, which historical events he actually got right. Let's take a closer look at a really famous example. The quatrain that supposedly predicted the Great Fire of London in 1666.
Oh, yeah, that one. I remember reading about that. It's definitely one of his most famous hit, quote unquote. So walk us through it. What's the specific language of that quatrain, and how do people connect it to the Great Fire?
Okay, so in this quatrain, Nostradamus writes, "The blood of the just will be lacking in London, burnt by fire in the year 66. Now, on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, I mean, 66, that's clearly the year 1666. And London, well, that's London. And fire, well, there's a big fire that year. Case closed, right?
Not so fast. There's that line about the blood of the just. That's where the interpretation gets a bit more, creative.
Okay, so how do Nostradamus's supporters explain that line? How do they connect it to the Great Fire?
They argue that the blood of the just refers to the many Protestant martyrs who were executed in London during the reign of Queen Mary V, who was known as Bloody Mary.
Ah, okay, I remember that from history class.
So they see this line as kind of foreshadowing the city's destruction by fire as a form of divine retribution for the persecution of those Protestants.
Wow, that's a pretty heavy interpretation. But I can see the logic there. It definitely fits the whole fire and brimstone vibe of prophecy.
Right, but what about the skeptics? Do they just dismiss it as a coincidence?
Yeah, what do they say?
They argue that the quatrains are so vague and open to interpretation that you can basically twist them to fit any event after the fact. It's like playing connect the dots, where you can draw the lines however you want to create a picture that fits your agenda.
So they're saying it's all just a matter of like cherry picking the quatrains that seem to fit, that it's more about confirmation bias than actual foresight.
Exactly. They point out that Nostradamus never actually mentions London by name in that quatrain. And they question whether the blood of the just can really be directly linked to those Protestant martyrs. They say it's just too easy to read meaning into these verses after a major historical event has happened.
I mean, that's a fair point. We humans love to look for patterns, to connect the dots, even if they're not really there. And especially with something like prophecy, which is so shrouded in mystery and intrigue. It's easy to get swept up in the excitement. It's like finding shakes in the clouds.
Right. We see what we want to see. And we haven't even talked about the translations. A lot of the translations of Nostradamus' work are actually quite unreliable. I mean, think about it. The quatrains have been translated and retranslated over the centuries, sometimes with a very deliberate agenda to make them fit certain events or interpretations.
So what I might be reading today in English could be a totally different beast than what Nostradamus originally wrote in French back in the 16th century.
Precisely. It's like a game of telephone where the message gets distorted with each retelling.
So where does that leave us? We have this ongoing debate. Is Nostradamus a genuine prophet or a master of ambiguity whose work is more about inspiring awe and wonder than providing concrete predictions? Where do we, the listeners, fit into all of this?
That's the exciting part. It leaves you with the challenge of engaging with these texts critically and forming your own conclusions. The beauty of Nostradamus' work is that it invites us to think for ourselves, to question assumptions, and to consider multiple perspectives. There's no one right answer.
It's like he's throwing down a gauntlet saying, here are my prophecies, now go and make of them what you will. It's all up to us, the readers, to decide.
Exactly, and that's what makes him so fascinating. Whether you buy into his prophetic abilities or not, There's no denying that his work has had a profound impact on our culture and our understanding of history.
He's become this larger-than-life figure, a symbol of mystery, of intrigue. And I think that's a big part of his enduring appeal. He keeps us guessing, he keeps us talking, he keeps us thinking.
And that's no small feat for someone who lived over 500 years ago.
Mm.
His work still has the power to spark our imaginations and challenge our assumptions about the world.
It's like we've explored his life, his work, the arguments for and against his prophetic abilities. This deep dive has been a whirlwind, but I'm curious, where do we go from here? What are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener will walk away with after all this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that Nostradamus, whether you think he was a true prophet or a master of symbolism, offers a really unique way to look at both history and the world around us.
You're right, it's a different perspective.
He encourages us to question our assumptions, to consider different viewpoints, and to, really be mindful of the forces that are shaping our lives.
It's like he's saying, hey, wake up, pay attention. The future is always happening and anything is possible.
Exactly. And in a world that's constantly changing, that's a pretty powerful message, don't you think?
Totally. This deep dive has been packed with insights, and honestly, I'm feeling inspired to go back and reread those quatrains with fresh eyes. What about you?
Oh, absolutely. I encourage you to do so, and I encourage you, the listener, to do the same. Explore those sources we've talked about. See what jumps out at you, what connections you make, what questions do you have as you go deeper into Nostradamus's world.
We've given you the map, but now it's your turn to explore the territory.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe you'll come up with your own interpretations of those cryptic verses.
Ooh, that would be awesome. To crack the code of Nostradamus, centuries after he wrote those mysterious predictions.
It's a tantalizing thought, and it leads us to our final thought for you to ponder. If Nostradamus were alive today, what would he be predicting about our future? What events would catch his eye? What warnings or hopes would he offer us?
Man, that's a question that's going to stick with me. Makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, there's more to his work than we realize.
And that, my friend, is the enduring legacy of Nostradamus. He may leave us with more questions than answers, but by doing so, he sparks our curiosity, challenges our assumptions, and really invites us to engage with the world in a more thoughtful, more inquisitive way.
Well said. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and maybe keep an eye on the stars. You never know what secrets they might reveal.